So in my conversation with Dr. Barr yesterday, the subject of mathematics and science came up. And this question of mathematics as being the kind of language of science, and perhaps an all-encompassing, all-pervading structure behind reality. Would you like to speak to that question?
Sure, happily. So, sort of in the history of where mathematics has fit into science, a lot of that happens with Galileo and with the Copernican revolution and so on, but they all go back to a farther history from Pythagoras. And according to them, all was number. So if you wanted to understand the fundamental nature of something and how it worked, you had to go back to some sort of a numerical example. And their famous example was plucking strings. So if you took a string and you divided it into, you just plucked it as it was, and then you took and sort of halved the length of it and plucked it again and made an octave sound, and at various other intervals, it made different intervals in terms of music that sounded good to the ear. So the fundamental aspect of reality, when Plato wrote his Republic, and he was trying to figure out how the education of the future rulers of the city should come along, he found that in order for them to do what they needed to do and exercise justice and be good leaders, they needed a good education. And one of the fundamental things that he chose for that education was mathematics. It's in Book 7 of the Republic where he lays this case out. The idea that mathematics would lead someone from the world of change to something that is eternal. People, when they deal with mathematics, find that in establishing some sort of a theorem, or what Euclid did in his Elements, for example, in proving all these geometrical theorems, is that once you've proven it, it just is. It's the way that it is. It's the way that it always has been, and you get this feeling of some deep truth to something there. And then all of the education then through learning mathematics leads you to think that, well, if it is possible to do this in mathematics, then there must be ways to lay hold to eternal truths in other fields of study. And ultimately, building up on that Platonic tradition, that was what led mathematicians later on and scientists later on to really find that once something could be quantified and understood in that type of a way, that somehow you were describing it at its base, most fundamental level.
Thank you very much. And thank you for letting me put you on the spot for the first question. So this is one way to think about the relation between God and natural reality, if we include mathematical realities within natural reality as part of the created order. I'm wondering how some of our other panelists think about this. How do you think about the relation between God and nature, which can be mapped in some cases onto religion or faith and science?
Well, I think one of the most fascinating things to me is that number as a category can be applied to God in the sense of, speaking of Trinity, 3 in 1. We're using numerical designations here, and of course this wouldn't be possible apart from revelation, making it known to us in some key fashion. But there's also, I think, some sense in which whenever we talk about the oneness of God, that is not exactly coterminous with, say, the oneness of this remote control that I'm holding. It's oneness in some kind of a sense that is entirely beyond that, and in such a way that it becomes possible to talk about things like 3 and 1 at the same time without engaging in any form of mutual contradiction of terms. So, and I also think maybe just to go laterally from that, that's one thing that just has always fascinated me, is just that aspect of the Trinity. But that mathematics and its application over the centuries has, I think, proven its power in the sense that once you obtain a particular description in mathematics, you can verify it over and over in scientific experiments and readouts. But then there's a sort of an additional twist at the end of it, which is the moment of contemplation and to say, oh, the orbits of the planets can be described this way, or, the velocity, and just having everything sort of fall in. It's a beauty that strikes one, and you have now a confined system that actually does give you some avenue of entry into the reality of the beauty of creation in a consistent and harmonious manner. So that's just part of, I think, almost an intellectual appeal about mathematics as a descriptor behind reality.
Thank you. That's interesting. And I'm glad you brought in contemplation. This is
Yes.
as an end. Anyone else want to jump in?
One of the things is we are a numbers society. I mean, everything is about statistics, and we all know Mark Twain's famous line that there are three excuse me. Most people tell me to quiet down, but I'm glad for that. We do, I think in the modern world, I mean, this is one of the hallmarks of modernity, is that we are focused on numbers. And I think that's important. That's why science has been driven. But there is a little bit of pushback, I think, in the sense that often number is very useful in describing those hows and giving us all sorts of ways of understanding the mechanisms, but it doesn't give us everything. What do statistics mean? I mean, this is one of the things that we always have to be asking. What are you measuring and what is it for? So I think there's an interplay between something, even in the natural world, different kinds of thinking have to be applied. Because when you reduce everything to the number, you often don't get the whole truth, but you get an important part of the truth.
Thank you. That's helpful. You? Anyone else?
I wanted to add to Professor Daly, Dr. Daly's comments, because he writes beautifully on beauty and symmetry in relation to numbers as well in one of his more recent articles. And so when we think about God and some things maybe we'll go and discuss as the primary efficient cause of all things, when we see nature, we see the effects that come from him, and the effects tell us something about the cause. And the discoveries of math and numbers reveal the elegance and beauty that are in that primary cause and give us to contemplate the importance of elegance and beauty in mathematics within the mind of God himself. And Dr. Daly writes beautifully on this as well.
Mr. Townsend, do you want to?
I'll take off slightly differently. I think
Sure.
When Galileo's great contribution to the development of science was the realization that the relationship between you can mathematize the scientific description by doing experiments and associating quantity with it. So the great advance that he initiated was the mathematization of science, and it's partly because of his Neoplatonic outlook, because he felt that that mathematics, or the mathematical description, was the very essences of things, and once you understood the mathematical aspects of it, you would look at analyzing the essence of something. But it developed into the wonderful enterprise that we have today, and the very exact description of reality. I think the mathematical penetration of description of reality, especially in terms of the inanimate world, is really quite profound, and our ability to describe natural things, especially in the inanimate world, is really amazing. So there is something about the fundamental quantitative aspects of things that really does profoundly describe their essence. It becomes much more difficult when you're talking about living things, but the quantitative description of inanimate nature is just amazing. When you think we can predict the shape of molecules and their behavior, and the way they behave solely in terms of their mathematical description, it is really quite incredible. Although we tend to lose other aspects, but it is.
Final causality, but we don't talk about that right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Final causality is yeah, we probably have a discussion with
Another panel.
philosophical
Another
causes.
panel.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's good.
there is. I think there is final causality in nature, whether you, even though it's not the final causality that the philosophers would want. But when you look at the concept of entropy and the natural laws that are obeyed, the idea of a natural law is in some sense a final cause, because the change that has to occur has to obey this particular law. So the notion of natural laws is an expression of, I think, a final causality in nature, even though we may not use that expression in the scientific community. And on a philosophical sense, that's what they are, because if you think what a final cause is supposed to be.
Dr. Daly, you were...
Yeah, I was going to say one more thing, just in terms of the beauty of that topic that comes through. One of the an argument that you can make from the difference between where the Ptolemaic system with the Earth in the center of the universe versus the heliocentric with the Earth going around the sun is that on the one hand, I mean, we have the experience every day of seeing the sun and the stars and the moon rise in the east and set in the west, that to our eyes we see the sense that the sun is moving around the earth, that we're the ones that are stationary. And one of the reasons that the heliocentric model was so, it sort of indicated that it was going to be, widespread consequences from it, was because in the development of that theory, it cleared up a lot of the controversy that was, or a lot of the confusion that was around it. The Ptolemaic system had a lot of difficulties in how to explain certain astronomical motions. The heliocentric model, on the other hand, it was simpler, it was clearer, and Copernicus, stated that. Kepler followed him and said that could see that it was going to have widespread consequences, was able to determine laws from it. Just the fact that it was beautiful in and of itself led to something that was more fundamental, and it really took that quantification that was necessary in order to be able to state it that way.
Thank you. Perhaps we could pivot a little bit. The question, it's not uncommon to have a student or someone come up and express anxiety or concerns about the relation between science and faith. That's part of why we're having this conference, is to bring some of these things out into the open and talk about them. We hope in a way that's illuminated by faith, but also expert knowledge on science. I'd be curious to know how some of you approach this. Do you approach it in terms of different types of language, different categories of language? I think last night you spoke of sort of almost two different circles. So how do you address these questions? Because even the questions we have today, we may answer them and then move on to different questions. But there's sort of a set of tools, conceptual tools, that we bring to these kinds of questions. And so I'd be curious to know how you address these things.
I think language and category are very important. And so this is actually, I think, one of the questions that are at the center of reconciling scientific discussion with religious discussion. And that would be the question of genres themselves that are used in literature. And it always comes back to the question of Genesis itself. What are the first 11 chapters of Genesis? What genre do they fall within? And really in 1948, as these questions were being addressed in view of all the scientific challenges, the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1948 to Cardinal Sahard, he was answering the question for them in terms of how do we approach it as history? And the Pontifical Biblical Commission gave very clear advice that it's to be interpreted according to the genre of its time, its cultures, the languages, the idioms in use, and they don't fall within a history in the way the Greco-Roman world told it. In fact, it's very hard to discern, is what the Pontifical Biblical Commission did, and then recommended this is the work that really must be done. And so I think we need to recognize that the categories of the 21st century are not the same categories that were being used when Genesis was written. And so I think there's been a lot of important work demonstrating with language studies, historical studies, the study of contemporary texts with the time of the writing of Genesis, Jeff Morrow has done a lot of important work in that area, and he's gone into what's a temple Christology, and he demonstrates really that we should be reading it in terms of more a liturgical context, and how worship develops us, and how God gives us worship to make us like himself. And so it's these kinds of distinctions in which we recognize that the sciences are talking and approaching one question that necessarily the original authors were not trying to address. And so we need to see what the original authors were addressing. So this is a little bit of the work that we do and the like.
Yeah, that's a very interesting line of thought, and it reminds me of when I first became Catholic. I realized as I came into the church that I still had a very Protestant understanding of the beginning of things, and a very Protestant understanding of the end of things. And so as I was reading books and articles that I thought were from trustworthy sources on both of these, that word liturgical kept coming up, both with regard to those chapters in Genesis, but also, say, the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse, that there's a way to read that final book in Scriptures as a liturgical text as well.
I think there's a good way to bring in what Dr. Townsend was talking about as well with the question on final causality. We see, certainly to some degree, we'll discuss Adam and Eve as Homo sapiens, but there's a final causality that creation presupposes vocation, and vocation, our final cause, being that God wished to make us, as the Catechism of the Catholic Church said, to make us sons in his only begotten Son. And so really there's a good connection we need to make between Homo sapiens and Homo liturgicus. And I think that would be an important focus of final causality, because we become like what we worship, and we're made in the image and likeness of God.
We'll make that actual at 11:30.
Well, I think to take up another point that you've been doing, Matthew, is that the success of natural science and its ability to describe the world and the way it behaves has kind of overshadowed the fact that the relationship between the way God works in nature and the way nature itself works. Because in medieval times it was a little more explicit, but and this is the great benefit of an education here at Christendom College, because the students do philosophy and theology, and as well as, if they do the natural science major, they do the sciences, because we've lost the Catholic view of the way that God interacts with nature. God is, in the biblical phrase is that we live, move, and have our being in God. And so even though things appear to move and influence one another in a way that's proper to themselves, but God is also operating in all his creatures. He is cooperating in their movement. When an object moves, it is true in some sense that God is actually moving that object because he's cooperating with its movement, because nothing can change without God being the source of the change. So the Catholic view of the way that creation works is that God is actually working through nature and cooperating with his creatures. So there is some sense of what God is causing all these things. He truly is, but he's cooperating with his creatures and creation, so that they are also the cause of movement of themselves. And it's proper that the natural sciences have their area of study and their terminology and their various methodologies and concepts, but at the same time, we, as Catholics, we need a wider view that God himself also is operating with his creation, and God is moving things in the unique way in which they're required to move. But he is the source of all movement and activity within creation too. So he's intimately connected with creation, and in some sense he's helping me talk. So even everything that changes, God is actually the source of the change.
Thank
and
you.
we tend to lose that sort of vision.
Yeah, that's helpful. Well, and I'm a little discouraged. Everyone seems to be in agreement here. It's a very boring panel when everybody agrees. Anybody want to take up this thread and take it in a different direction, or
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a little bit. I mean, I think what I heard in your original question was something along the lines of if a student comes up to you and, is sort of wrestling with the relationship between science and faith, how does one work with them effectively? And, I think one of the things, at least in my encounters with students, one of the things they're pushing sometimes pretty hard is, look, the explanatory power of science. Science explains everything. That's the postulate that they have subscribed to. And then, you push them a little bit and you start to say, what about this, what about that? And they sort of begin to back off, but they're holding to a postulate that still says, well, science one day will explain everything. It'll provide it this way, it'll provide, evolutionarily, it'll do it, through the expansion of physics, and, on and on and on. They have sort of imbibed a particular perspective or worldview here. And so what I like to do in those circumstances is when they start to acknowledge, oh, well, we don't have everything. We don't have the full explanation yet from science. Then I'll say, don't you see? You're making a profound act of faith in scientism. And why would you want to do that when you actually don't know what the future of science is going to unveil? And shouldn't you be looking much more carefully and circumspectly at the real claims of faith and have a place where you can place your faith much more securely and not have to sort of just make a blind act of faith in a potential future that science may or may not unveil? And I think that throws them for a little bit of a loop. Sometimes like, oh, gee, yeah, maybe science isn't all it's been, chalked up to be, and I need to be a little bit more broad-minded here, because I think that this subscribing to science as a religion of its own is very narrow-minded at the end of the day. It fails to really take the full breadth of reality. And sometimes, what I'll do, again, with students will be something to the effect of, well, when you sit and you listen to a beautiful Beethoven symphony, or you experience what it is to really genuinely be loved by another human being, are you telling me that's nothing more than just the neurons banging around inside your heads? And they'll say, well, no, it's something more than that. So you have to sort of, I think, expand their horizons because they've been trained to focus in this manner and sort of do violence then to reality by that intentional decision to focus only on a type of scientism.
Thank you. Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think added to that is the way people read Scripture, I think, is profoundly influenced by a kind of evangelical fundamentalist sense that it's only the literal sense that matters. When I teach students, I like to teach them that they're in the traditional interpretive structure of Catholic reading. In addition to talking about genre, the type of text that we're talking about, every text can be interpreted with different senses. There is that literal sense, but then there are the typological senses. Certain things stand for other things. The Catechism will talk about the entire Scripture speaks of Christ, and it's Christ speaking to us. But then there are also moral aspects, and then there are also those aspects which were related to our final end. I think George said the beginning and the ends are the tricky parts. And explaining to students that, look, when you read Scripture, it's going to teach you things, but you do have to think about the fact that, getting a literal sense of a text is very difficult because of genre problems. If I say to you, my love is like a red, red rose, and then I show you a picture, and it's like, well, it looks like a brown-haired, middle-aged woman, right? Well, in what way is she like a red, red rose? Well, now we're talking about something different. And the further we read in Scripture, which is not a catechism or an encyclopedia of doctrine, but it is a collection of books that are inspired and that have been written both by a divine author and a human author. This goes to Dr. Townsend's comments about causality. The more we see how things can be mysterious and they can fit together in a much more profound way if we're reading things correctly and not taking complete faith in a sort of one view of the way things work, which is that scientific view.
I wanted to mention the catechism. You brought up a really great, interesting point there. And I think if to summarize the relationship between faith and science would be, faith is really dealing more with primary causality, and science is dealing more with secondary causality. And a quick, for instance, would be the Baltimore Catechism. Who made you? And you would say, God made me. And I'd look at you a little funny and say, really? Just God all by himself? No one else was involved? And so that's when we fall into secondary causality, and that's what the sciences are really about. God is being itself, and he communicates being to his creatures, and those creatures are dependent on God for their being, and yet God makes them beings that are capable of causing. And so the big difference is simply theology. Who made you? God. But we also have to admit there were secondary causes involved in making you.
Thank you very much. Anyone, we are going to need to wrap up. Anybody have any final comments you want to make? Anybody want to jump in? Should we let mathematics? You want to have the final word?
Sure. I was actually thinking about the question about the conversation with students and where that goes. In terms of questions about deeper meaning in mathematics, whether philosophically or theologically, most mathematicians just tend to be allergic to those questions and to totally avoid them. But what's interesting is that now with AI becoming a big thing, especially in mathematics, they're finding that theorems or conjectures that people had posed a long time ago are starting to fall to some of these AI models, and it's actually forcing mathematicians to think about what the nature of mathematical thought really is. Like, what's a human's role in doing mathematics in a way that they hadn't before? Because if a machine can do it all, and a machine can make all of the different connections for us, where are we supposed to be left? So I think it's interesting that mathematicians who have tended to avoid that question for such a long time are now finding that they're right in the heart of that difficulty. When it comes with those interactions with students, though, really it's a matter of just cultivating the wonder that's present there. That so many questions about deeper meaning and deeper realities just come out of thinking about what it is that you know, how it is that you know it, the beauty that's present within that, and ultimately that's where the best conversations tend to begin with students.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking time to be part of this conversation. We're going to be all continuing. This was more of a theoretical conversation, but we'll be continuing on in our next sessions after Mass. To look more at applied science and mathematics. We'll start thinking about tools and our separated sections. And then we'll come back this afternoon with Dr. Barr to again kind of go back to the high level of the theoretical. So hope to see you all at Mass, and thank you for your attention, and thank you for your time, gentlemen. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.